Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 185. And this episode, we're not here to fight. But we do have some goals in mind, and hopefully, as challenging as it may be, we'll get there together. Because we're talking about games without combat, but not without conflict. And to join us in that, we brought on a fellow podcaster, games journalist, thinker online in the indie space. We brought on TroytlePower. Thank you for joining us for this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
TroytlePower, you've done several. I'm not going to be able to keep that up. I'm not going to be able to say your full name the entire episode.
Please, we've made the formal introduction.
Yeah. But you have done several side quests for us, and we have collaborated on some other stuff as well. You've been on Reignite not that long ago. Mm-hmm. Before we get into the episode, I would love for you to promote, and because I'm only saying this whole thing once, I have it pulled up in front of me. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about TroytlePower Presents, the Power Playthroughs podcast with TroytlePower?
I absolutely can. I actually have edited the title slightly. If you look it up, it now says -a video game podcast at the end because SEO didn't know what to make of TroytlePower Presents the Power Playthroughs podcast with TroytlePower.
SEO, the greatest conflict.
It is. Unfortunately, you can't fight it. It is a audio-only Let's Play podcast. The idea is that it's Twitch for your ears. I play a game, and I talk about it, and I tell you what's going on in the game, and also go off on random tangents, just like you'd get from a Twitch streamer, but it's actually geared towards being able to appreciate it as an audio-only thing, although in practical terms, there's almost always a video to go with the audio-only episode, because that's just how I've been recording lately. So if you want to actually see the audio-only podcast, it's on YouTube and you can see the game footage and stuff, but that's not the correct format. The correct format is just to listen to it or watch it on YouTube with your eyes closed. Cause that way still, you know, the numbers help, but you're getting the proper experience that way.
Now, do you have audio from the games you're playing as a sort of radio of the mind Foley to what you're doing?
Yeah, the start of this was when I was driving 2 hours for work a couple times a week, and I would just stop on the side of the road and play a game on my Game Boy, just recording, you know, with a microphone with the volume up on the game. And that's still how I'm doing Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages. I'm playing very slowly. Like, I've been 3 years trying to play through this game. The blue one, yeah. And that's still how I'm playing that one, is I'm almost always recording in my car.
How Hunter S. Thompson of you.
It's very fun. It's a very weird... There's a whole community of us. There's dozens of us making audio-only Let's Play podcasts. We have a whole Discord that's just us. Come hang out. But lately I've been doing a lot of indie games and things like that because there's enough people that listen to it. And then along with that, I write over at Geek to Geek Media that people keep letting me play games for free. And so I keep actually sitting at my desk and recording them. But I miss doing it just sitting in the car. That's the way the podcast should be.
Thank you for bringing the original context and the intended idea to our listeners so that they know what to do. Mm-hmm. But it is people continuing to allow us to play games for free in this industry that brings us here today.
That's true. The idea of this topic, and I do have to actually shout out friend of the show, Dave Jackson, who contributed to the brain power that came up with this topic of games with conflict but no combat. And what we mean by that is no combat mechanics. And the inspiration for this was a game that all three of us got review codes for. Mm-hmm. Shout out to fellow Traveler and Double Jump Communications.
Yes.
We got codes for Citizen Sleeper 2, which I've written a review on the Patreon. Troy, I know you've done several things with it. You did your end credits series on it, which is my favorite podcast you do. It's perfect for someone who listens to too many podcasts because they're like 3 to 5 minutes long, and it's just you after rolling credits sharing your immediate thoughts. For those who haven't played Citizen Sleeper 1 or 2, it is basically a tabletop RPG in video game format with dice, and though there is conflict in those games, there's no combat mechanics like, you know, hack and slash, turn-based combat, whatever. You're moving through decisions you make with the dice. Now, you could argue that there are combat moments in the game, but it's not really like combat-driven in the same way something like a Skyrim is or Hades is. I think that it's an interesting thing to look at because Geoff and I have covered games without violence in them, games like Animal Crossing and the like. And this just feels like a different divergence of like a similar idea. And it's always unique to see how games push combat or conflict without you specifically having to do those combat mechanics that are in a lot of video games.
It's one of those aspects, I think, of limitations on the production side benefiting what comes through on the consumer side. If you want to have real-time action combat, you have to have a physics engine. You have to have combat that feels good for whatever value that is. You have to have a lot of cogs, of cause and effect, working together to be satisfying on several levels. If you want to have turn-based combat, that's its own menu-driven combat or choice system or anything else. And so this is where you get a lot of, the joke in the indie space of, well, everything can be a visual novel. Well, yeah, it's choice. This leads to this, leads to this. And you can maybe add a little bit of random number generation, which the Blades in the Dark driven gameplay of Citizen Sleeper facilitates, or a lot of other wrinkles and complications in choice-driven gameplay that a lot of indie games of certainly the last few years that I've noticed have flourished with.
I think one important note on Citizen Sleeper, especially if somebody hasn't played it, Matt described it as derived from tabletop gameplay, and I think for a lot of people, their first thought when they hear that is Dungeons and Dragons. But
yes,
that's true. Yeah.
What Geoff brought up there, it's Blades in the Dark is the system that this is based on. I don't know Blades in the Dark well, but it is a tabletop role-playing system that just doesn't have combat as a specific thing. You can bring combat into it through choice and through the story developing, but it doesn't have a system for combat, which I think is maybe not the specific thing that is the definition for this conversation, but I think that's important. The idea that combat exists in that game, but without a combat system facilitating it. It just happens within non-combat related mechanics.
Violence has as much a fade to black as anything else does, honestly.
Yeah.
The funny thing is that also Gareth Damian Martin has gone on to say that there won't be another Citizen Sleeper game likely, but there will be a tabletop version of it, which I think is exciting and an interesting conversion because it's going to be pretty easy. And like Geoff was hinting at visual novels before, which we've talked about on the show before, at its core, you could boil down Citizen Sleeper to a book and video game form with a few dice because it is basically a visual novel RPG, which while a lot of other visual novels don't have those systems, right? It still has a ton of systems. Just one of the systems it doesn't have is combat. A game that's, I think, similar to this and is, I don't want to say a lot more popular, but for sure more widely known in the indie space is Disco Elysium, which I've played at least twice, and I will probably be playing again this year for a future project, because of course, why not? It's not like there are no other games to play. And that's a game where there is tons of conflict in that game. But I can only think off the top of my head of one like standard combat shootout moment, and it's a dice roll, but there's no mechanics or framework to it. It's the same dice roll you would do for not giving into becoming a fascist or not having a very stupid conversation with a very smart person or not trying to get your necktie off the ceiling fan and dying in the process.
This truly is the podcaster's life. Yeah.
Basically, yeah. I think it's really interesting when a game chooses to do that because I'm someone who sucks at video games. That's an oversimplification. But needless to say, I'm not the most strategic thinker when it comes to combat. And so, like, for example, I'm playing Avowed right now, which I'm loving. But, like, my combat is I have a two-hand sword, smash thing with two-handed sword till dead, then move on. It's very oversimplified for a game that has tons of cool stuff in it that I am just basically ignoring.
You wounded me with that. The combat is so good in that game.
It is. And I have diversified some stuff, but like I'm oversimplifying for the sake that like I think when a game goes down a route of not having a combat system and trying to tell a story that way, I find it's always more unique. Not that there aren't unique combat systems, but like again, the two games we've mentioned so far, well, the series of Citizen Sleeper and Disco Elysium are lauded games for their storytelling. In my experience, most games that don't have combat are either very mechanically heavy in a different way or very story-driven. Because the other end of this is something like Balatro, which has no story, but also, does it have combat?
Does it have a story? Does it have combat? I don't know. That game's weird.
Right.
It has both. You just have to deal with it.
Yeah. But I think it's really interesting when games get to do that. And I think I enjoy those games more sometimes.
It's interesting bringing up Balatro is that that opens up that there's a whole genre issue where there's tons of genres that I think are combat devoid, but even within that it's not complete. I was trying to I was coming up with ideas, and so rhythm games obviously don't have combat, but does Elite Beat Agents have combat? Because I think it might have combat and it's a rhythm game.
Clearly you haven't played Slap Happy Rhythm Busters on the PS1. the rhythm
Sure.
fighting game.
Sure.
I mean, I haven't either.
Patapon has combat and is a rhythm game. But in
Patapon
theory,
has
it's
war.
Like, it's a rhythm game. It shouldn't have combat. And that's the case with puzzle games. Puzzle games shouldn't have combat. But Marvel Puzzle Quest is like the puzzle game I've played most in my life. And it's fighting, but it's fighting through puzzles. Is that a combat system?
I put a lot of time into Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, which doesn't have, it has a single player mode, but you're always up against an opponent. That is abstraction.
So, like, it's a puzzle mechanic, but it's also the combat mechanic, quotes around, it is the combat mechanic for the game?
What this comes down to is the idea of combat versus conflict in pursuit of a goal. Even before we put video in front of games, games have existed for as long as civilization, I would argue. And it's kind of that idea of no matter what, it is overcoming something, reaching a goal, reaching a win state, reaching, solitaire is a very fun and frustrating way to organize your deck. If you really want to break it down to that, but it still is in pursuit of a goal. Whether you want to call it a violent form of conflict or simply head-to-head, Pong has conflict, but Pong does not have combat.
Doesn't have combat, yeah.
And so this turns into abstraction of whether or not we are engaging in a form of what would be considered violence, which I suppose would become the kind of thing of, if people were doing this in real life, how would we term it? Pong is playing tennis or table tennis. Violence can ensue from a particularly heated game of table tennis, but it would not be considered itself violent or combative, nor would something like Balatro. Despite the fact that using the dagger joker does cause you to destroy cards, you're not engaging in combat or combative actions. The fun on this, and something I wanted to get to before, thank you for coming with me on my rant. Troy, you brought up an excellent thing in comparing Blades in the Dark to Dungeons & Dragons. This now comes down to mechanics. You have to have means of resolving your conflict, means of resolving your choices. Dungeons & Dragons uses a 20-sided die to resolve social conflicts and martial conflicts. And now a social conflict, those are skill checks, skill challenges, whatever people want to call them. And if you do too many of those in succession, it drags. It feels slow. It feels annoying. It feels frustrating. Let's have this conversation. Let's set this up. Cool, you have set the difficulty. Roll your persuasion or deception check, depending upon if you're telling the truth, don't tell me, kind of thing. And I'll roll insight as the opposing check. Cool, we've resolved this entire social conflict. And then, well, that social conflict didn't go well. Roll initiative. We are now going to spend the rest of the 3.5 hours we have every 3 weeks to play Dungeons & Dragons to go through 24 seconds, 4 rounds of combat. And we're still going to resolve them with individual dice rolls. And so if you have to describe each and every one of those, it is essentially the frame rate of your game slowing down as it tries to render in basically PowerPoint the conflict and combat system for your point-and-click game, if you were truly to put that up there. We actually had Gareth on here to talk about the first Citizen Sleeper. Like, you bring up that it's tabletop based and people presume one way when you're really coming in from the other.
Yeah, totally. This conversation goes above and beyond, like I said earlier, games without conflict. But what I think also is interesting is I was thinking about something the other day. Pokemon Go has no combat. They removed it from the game to make it easier. You throw a Pokeball, you get a Pokemon. There's no combat. You don't do the turn-based choose a move, attack mechanic. That's an interesting path to go down when... What if a series goes in a different direction and removes combat from that series? And other series have done that. I mean, you think about all the Mario spin-off games, right? There's no combat in those. I mean, the combat in Mario is very basic. You jump on thing dies.
Yeah, it is still combat. And they prove that in Super Paper Mario, where they have brought the RPG idea into side-scrolling platforming, actually having damage values as you jump on things.
I want to jump back to Pokemon Go real quick, because Pokemon Go does have combat when you're battling the gyms.
Yes, it does.
Oh, that's right.
The reason I think that's an important detail to note is that gets pulled back into the Pokemon Let's Go games on the Switch, where you catch Pokemon the same way you do as in Pokemon Go. There's no combat associated with catching Pokemon, but then you still battle gym leaders. And it's weird, and it makes that game feel so conflicted. Like, you don't get to learn combat in the safe space of battling a wild Pokemon in that game. You just get thrown into it with trainers. I'm speaking from experience because I tried to play that game with my kid, and when we got to the combat, it was disorienting for him because we've just been having a chill time, and then suddenly combat's back. So even a game that tried to remove combat, it still has it in there in Pokemon Go. It's a different framework, but it's like they couldn't quite pull it out entirely and still be Pokemon, maybe?
Well, it moved its means of conflict resolution. If you are playing Pokemon Red, Pokemon Violet, Pokemon any of those, you are catching Pokemon using the same systems through which you do gym battles. You are having your conflict resolution consistent throughout. There are different challenges inherent in that. Your gym battles and your trainer battles, you want to get them to 0, period. If you are fighting a wild Pokemon, maybe you want to get them to 0 hit points so you get the experience. Maybe you don't so you can catch them. There's variance and wrinkles in it, but it is the same system of conflict resolution. Here, you have taken apart a perfectly good grilled cheese sandwich and given me buttered bread and a slice of cheese at completely different times in my meal.
Right, one's the appetizer. You have to finish it before you get the other.
Right, exactly. Eat the bread, then we'll give you the cheese. It's grilled cheese. So you've put melted cheese on a plate. It's a grilled cheese. Okay, fine.
No, but that's a good point. I had forgotten that because I also, like, who remembers the gym battles? That's not the memorable part of Pokemon Go. But you're right. I had Let's Go Pikachu because Pikachu's the superior of the two. But we can fight about that later.
How dare you?
I'm getting death stares from both of the other people on the call. It's funny because I had forgotten that too about that game. A game that I genuinely liked but didn't finish. But I understood it because I have played Pokemon since its inception. So for me, it wasn't confusing. But for a new player who only played Pokemon Go and didn't do the gym battles because all they cared about was walking around and finding the Pokemon, it's completely out of left field. And I think that makes it worse. If the game had like some kind of conflict resolution, like visual novel component to the gym battles, like you had to solve a puzzle or like befriend the Pokemon or do a mini game, it probably would have worked much better for the way that game was set up. And it hadn't even occurred to me that even games that try to do it don't always do it flawlessly. One of the things that we're lucky with the incredible indie games that we get at this point, there's so many different ways to do games without combat, but still have conflict that is meaningful. And that's not to say games like Animal Crossing aren't meaningful. This is not to be confused with the cozy game. We were joking about this before, but Stardew Valley is listed on Google for a game without combat, which you can play it without combat. It would be much harder, but it absolutely has combat. And so I think there's this kind of confusion with people talking about games without combat and then games that are cozy, which can be the same thing, but aren't always. Like I would consider Balatro, I'll never say it right, Balatro, which we were talking about earlier, as a cozy game, right? It doesn't always feel cozy when you're stressed out fighting a blind, but you can get into a zone and it can feel cozy. And I guess I just like that this conversation lends to re-examining genre is basically what we're doing to find games that fit this specific niche. So
building off Balatro, there's a game called Dungeons and Degenerate Gamblers that is...
I've been meaning to play that, the blackjack one.
Yeah, it's a blackjack. It's blackjack. It's just blackjack Balatro. It's not just that, but that gives you enough to go on.
Blackjack. Got it.
I
can't be the first one to have made that joke, but I'm the first one on this show.
No, I hate it. It hurts me.
Blackjack.
The Balak, that part. Anyway, the thing that's interesting about it for this conversation is that it is head-to-head. You are playing blackjack against somebody else. You get a card, they get a card. First 21 wins, except for when the rules get thrown out because it's like Balatro. But the conflict resolution, to go back to the phrase Geoff's been using, in that game is that both players have health, and it is represented by a heart. And when you score a better hand than them, it does damage to their health. And that's how you defeat them. And it is like so unnecessary. Like, it's a gambling game. We have a system for measuring success in gambling. It's called money, but they use money for a different thing in that game to buy upgrades to cards. So they had to have something else be the conflict resolution there, and they made it health because it's a video game. Why not?
Because why not?
It never occurred to me how strange that was until having this conversation. I'm like, why does that game have health? Why is it pictured as a fight? Like, I don't know. It's a very weird one to me.
Because the earliest forms of interaction in any kind of video game that wasn't built off of a sport or puzzle was violence. It was the easiest way hit someone with sticks. Like the easiest way to represent something with Look, I got 5 pixels and $12. What do? I'm going to have 4 of those pixels hit each other kind of idea. Let's pull this even further. Let's iterate on this with card games. Does Inscription have combat?
Ooh.
It has violence. It has a lot of violence.
I think that the card game within Inscription has combat.
Okay.
Like the animals are
doing damage to each other.
It is abstracted combat. It goes back to like, is Marvel Puzzle Quest have combat? But I would say it's on that same level. Where
it's as much combat as Magic the Gathering, let's say.
Sure, yeah.
Something like that.
Exactly.
One of those sort of head-to-head card games. You're not having an abstract, the so-called everybody knows the rules to poker, so you know how to form hands in Balatro. Everybody knows how blackjack works, so yes, you have an opponent, but do you really? Versus you are playing against a shadowy figure, let's say, if you haven't played Inscription yet, and you are facing them. That is an opponent, and that conflict is through, you would say, Troy, combat in cards.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, I realize I'm coming on very aggressively when I say this. I'm like, I just like to define this.
It did. Suddenly I felt like I was on the stand. But
that's why I pulled back. I'm like, no. Sorry, this is a friendly conversation, but just like
got closer and closer to the microphone and the camera as you did that.
Answer the question, Troy. What do the cards mean?
I think that Magic the Gathering and Inscription have combat the same way Dungeons and Dragons does.
Perfect.
In that there is a system that is specifically designed to represent combat.
And there's even life totals.
Yeah, I think those count.
Okay.
Weirdly, I don't think Marvel Puzzle Quest does for a stupid reason, which is that Bejeweled existed first. And so its combat system wasn't actually designed for combat. It was adapted to abstractly represent combat. But I don't think that counts.
No, it's a way of setting a win condition.
Yeah.
Right. It's a mechanic, but the mechanic itself isn't combat in the way we define it in a game. In a similar way, like you said, Bejeweled and the like, Zuma, all of these puzzle games where there's conflict, but not necessarily combat. Although it's funny because you talk about Magic and like my brain goes to both Hearthstone and MTG Arena. Mm-hmm. And those are video games that are depicting the card games that have combat. But technically in those games, you're simulating the card game. So is there really combat, or are you just simulating the combat of the card game?
I say
it's
combat.
A laying down card simulator, but the cards happen to represent combat.
Combat, yeah.
And this is one of those things where in, say, there are violent actions or there are altercations that happen in a game like Citizen Sleeper 1 or 2 that happen in something like Disco Elysium that you make a choice, conflict resolves. You would have something similar in Magic the Gathering Arena, this cardboard simulator, if you were playing a series of games and there was some matter of how you built your deck, what you chose, and you went into it, and there was a random number generator that decided how this was resolved. This is versus what Magic the Gathering Arena is getting to play only the conflict and roll initiative segments of Dungeons and Dragons. Where whether you're playing that through Baldur's Gate 3 or at your table or over Zoom with friends scattered to the winds, that is still having a system for combat with winners and losers and life totals and violent actions chosen, however abstracted.
I have a weird curveball.
Excellent.
Yeah, please.
Does Lil Gator Game have combat?
Oh, I see. I like this. And this is so funny because we've interviewed one of the devs For those who haven't played Little Gator Game, the story is about a little brother welcoming home his big sister that he used to play pretend with all the time. And the whole island was like decked out in cardboard cutouts so they could do this grand fantasy LARP adventure. And you were running around swinging a sword at cardboard cutouts. But technically, there's no combat mechanic. They can't fight back. You can't get hurt. You can't die. There's no lose condition. So is that really combat, or is it just part of the flailing of exploration?
I would say it is not combat. I would say that is interacting with the environment. But you're right, Troy, in bringing this up. There is that splitting of hairs in, well, combat is an interacting of environment. In fact, it's an interacting with people's entire worlds. When you really get down to it, you could be ending their world or they could end yours. But the same idea of Arzette, the Jewel of Faramore, you have that very CDI jank intentionally put in where all of Arzette's interactions use her sword.
To talk.
Yeah. They give, I forget what the term is because I played it pretty soon after it came out, so it's been about a year, of like it's a safe sword or it's a magic sword in some way.
It's a magic sword that can't hurt your friends.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And they even make fun of that at one point where it's just like, this doesn't hurt friendly people. And you're acting pretty unfriendly right now, Mr. Mayor, kind of thing is a threat. And so it's a way of abstracting, look, we don't need a talk button. Swinging your sword is the action button. The action can be swinging your sword or it could be initiating an interaction with whomever you hit with the sword in that range. So I would say Little Gator Game is the kind of thing of you are doing a more 3D platformer kind of world without combat that allows for the sword as a mechanism to interact. That is your action button, as it were.
Well, you can have conflict without combat. Can you have combat without conflict?
Right, exactly, because that's what you get in Little Gator Game, I think.
Yes.
Especially because, going back to the question of whether in Magic the Gathering Arena you're playing Magic the Gathering or you're playing laying down cards, in Little Gator Game, is Lil Gator experiencing combat? Absolutely. But are you as the player experiencing combat? Because he's imagining that those monsters are absolutely fighting back against him. I think it is I think it has combat but does not have violence. I think that's my stance on Little Gator Game.
I like that kind of brain exercise, though. It's fun to see what are the building blocks of any video game because, like Geoff was saying earlier, there is a game for Atari literally called Combat, and it's just tanks pew-pewing at each other, pixel by pixel.
Adventure has combat, but it's basically pick up sword, walk at thing, holding sword, object towards thing.
I think it's really funny to then look at the Little Gator Game question. That's such a particularly, I'm going to call you out, Troy, question to ask. And I love it because it does get at the root of like, what does it mean to have or not to have combat in your video game? Just in the same way that I made Magic the Gathering Arena, cardboard paper simulator, basically, right? Like the card game has combat, but the player doesn't. And I think that's really funny. But thinking about classic platformers and stuff, right? There are tons of platformers that don't have combat, that it's all about puzzle solving and jumping. I mean, you could say Super Meat Boy doesn't have combat.
Yeah.
It's platforming. It's conflict. Celeste also
was on my list, yeah.
No combat, but conflict. And like I love those kinds of games too. Geoff and I played one, Love Eternal, we played the demo of at PAX West. And that's one where it's a horror platformer, but in the same kind of switching gravity, hardcore platforming like Celeste has. And that's a horror game. And like I think if a platformer like that had combat, the horror could still work, but I think the fact that it's just doing the punishing platforming with horror really works because there's no combat. The conflict is the conflict you create or that the horrors create.
Well, and this comes into an argument of definition by arguing over who is the agent and arbitrator of the combat, and in this case with things like Super Meat Boy or Love Eternal, or to make another PlayStation reference, Abe's Odyssey, let's say, the Oddworld games.
Yes.
The violence is perpetrated by the environment. It is not man versus man. It is man versus world. In those classic, man versus God, man versus machine, whatever, man is the colloquial humanity idea. Horror games really throw that into sharp relief where those are games with conflict, and the goal is not necessarily to surmount or overcome the conflict, but to survive or evade the conflict. The original Resident Evil games were very much ones where there was combat, but it was much easier and better to avoid them. The Clock Tower games, get the hell away. And a lot of horror games are built around avoiding what would become combat. And I think that's something where you get games like Citizen Sleeper. The thing about not having a combat system, but having conflict to resolve, alters or contextualizes your sense of agency and your sense of power. There's a great deal of power fantasy in a lot of combat that we get in video games. Think of all of the side-scrolling shoot-'em-ups. The entire Metal Slug series is pretty much, let's go big boom, throw another quarter in, ha 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 ha, kind of feeling. And a very stereotypically gamer solution, add more DACA, blow it up, a violent action to finish it all off. But Citizen Sleeper is sci-fi capitalism gig economy. And so those times where it's like, man, it would just be so much easier to blow this up or to cause these things. Yeah, but you still have to eat. And you still have to synthesize what you need to keep your body going. You still need to do all of these things. And so the conflict is low level and ongoing, except when it explodes. But it is still avoiding the violent conflict. So a system that allowed for it even once, I think, in something like Citizen Sleeper, one would be asking way too much programming on the part of the dev team, but it would be a betrayal of what the game was about.
What's interesting about Citizen Sleeper and the idea of horror games in this as well, Alien Isolation is the one I thought of when you were talking about that.
Yeah.
A game, I don't play it. I've played like 8 minutes of that game and pooped my pants and shut it off. But that's a game that has like a constant and imminent threat of violence, but there's not combat. If the violence happens, you lost, from my understanding. Maybe there's combat later in the game, but my understanding is like, no, you just die. Like, you don't fight the alien when you get caught. You just die. That's the end.
Combat is a lose condition.
Yeah, right. And in Citizen Sleeper, there is not a constant threat of violence, but like every station I went to in Citizen Sleeper 2, I felt like, okay, is somebody gonna fight me here? And I like physical conflict as described in the text of that game only happened maybe 3 times throughout my playthrough of Citizen Sleeper 2, but I never felt safe from it. It always felt like that could be right around the corner. It's interesting because Citizen Sleeper 2 definitely doesn't have a combat system, and combat doesn't occur frequently in the narrative, but like it is not the game that jumps to top of mind for me when I think of games without combat, because it feels like that presence is always so close by, even though there's no actual combat represented mechanically, and when it is represented narratively, it's brief and infrequent. It's not a game that feels peaceful to me, I guess would be the difference, which goes back to the idea of combat versus conflict, I suppose.
It's why a game that just popped into my head was void from this conversation, but I think the reason I like talking about conflict without combat also is because it takes genres that are defined by combat and makes them even more interesting. I'm thinking of Animal Well, a game with tons of conflict, but there's no combat. I mean, I guess you could argue the firecrackers destroy the shades, but even still, it's a consequence of you using a thing. It's a puzzle-solving Metroidvania, a game I would have never imagined could exist until Animal Well came out, because combat is so tied to the genre namesake of Metroid and Castlevania.
Yeah.
And I think it comes from the same thing. The reason I didn't think of that is the same way, Troy, for you with Citizen Sleeper 2, especially, because I felt like I was in conflict with that world at every turn, because I felt like I was always going to die or always get stuck. And so it's funny how our brains will kind of associate conflict with combat, even if there's no specific combat mechanics, because of how well a story or world is developed.
And this constant triggering of the fight or flight response is the cornerstone of chronic anxiety, complex PTSD, and all manner of other issues that plague society today. Hi there. I'm Geoff Moonen from Fun and Games Podcast. But the fact of the matter is, that is true. This is the thing of you feel that stress no matter what. And so you only need violence to erupt once, twice, 3 times in a 15-hour game for the promise of it, the fear of it to be legitimized. And it doesn't even have to have a roll initiative moment. It doesn't have to have a battle screen pop up. The threat is there, and it is much an aspect of the fear and the conflict. There is no quick time action. There is no reflex gameplay in Citizen Sleeper. And there are many games of its ilk, regardless of setting and scope, that are also that same way, where there is no point where Twitch gameplay is required. I would argue that actually helps and that serves it, where those times where you sit there, you look at how many, the dice rolls that you have, you are on a contract, and you only have so many cycles left before something really bad happens, and all of these things. And it is, again, the day-to-day stress of, I have this much money, I have this much fuel, I need to do this to get money. Anybody who has had to have that argument with themselves of, do I have enough money to eat? Do I have enough money to get gas, to get to the job, to get enough money to pay for food? That is the sort of conflict that you find in those sorts of games. And fortunately, Citizen Sleeper lets you take all the time in the world to plan out how you're going to use those roles. And that is the joy of fantasy. But the conflict, you're absolutely right, Troy. It's ever present.
What I think is really juicy about this, you enlightened something in me, is that when there is not a combat system, when conflict is resolved through something else, it can fit the narrative better.
Yes.
Yes.
And generally, it means that there's going to be a fail state or a loss of the combat that is not a fail state. Like in Halo, I'm going to win every fight. Like, give me enough time and I'm going to just shoot them all. That's what's going to happen to that.
Game over, start again, start the fight again.
Right, but in Citizen Sleeper, in a game where the conflict is not resolved through a mechanical system, it allows for my character to be involved in the combat in a way that makes more sense. I feel like I am playing Halo. It is my skills on display, not Master Chief's, when I'm shooting people.
Right.
In Citizen Sleeper, it is my character in that moment, and it is their skills, which at that moment is the dice roll, that's going to determine the outcome of the combat, or, you know, wrenching a toilet pipe, like whatever you're doing in that game. It feels more like the character's ability than my ability, which is super engaging.
And this goes to a lot of actually what we were talking about last episode when we had Stomp on to talk about open-ended choices. There is great joy in failure in games like this. Not always, but there can be, because it's not just game over, damn it. It is, we failed that. Now what? The idea of conflict being not a whole tree of choices and moments and reaction times that we, holding the controller or hitting the buttons, see. What differences does a game like Citizen Sleeper or Disco Elysium have from the fighting fantasy and lone wolf game books of the 70s and 80s? Well, a lot of extra things under the hood that a computer system can take care of for us to make a more enriching thing. But it is, you make the choice, you accept the consequence, you move on, not you try it again. If something goes wrong on a contract and you're like, damn, I want another try on that, you're going to have to start another file. Yeah. You have to make a whole new sleeper. You're seeing it through narratively. You're absolutely right, Troy.
Well, and I love that too, Troy. The thing you got to the core of, which my brain was kind of trying to wrap around, is that narrative can be stronger when you remove the combat system and the conflict just happens in the narrative. I think of, as a new to horror person, two of my favorite indie horror games have conflict but no combat. Iron Lung, which is literally an hour long, and it's puzzle solving, the video game, but also you're terrified underwater.
Way too scary. Don't play it. Don't play that game. It's too scary.
I loved it so much. And then last year, Mouthwashing, one of my favorite games of last year, there's one moment later in the game where you're sort of in this dream state combat moment, but there's no combat mechanic. Like, it's basically a combat puzzle. But for the most part, when you have a weapon, it's puzzle solving, not combat. And so the conflict just feels more raw with this stranded crew. I love that. And I couldn't agree more that I think the reason I feel so much stronger to the narratives of Citizen Sleeper and Disco Elysium, or these horror games that I've mentioned, or a bunch of stuff that we've mentioned in this episode, is just exactly that. And I hadn't quite made that connection. Doing the combat is always fun and has a ton of great moments in a lot of games. But there's something about the narrative just telling you, here's what happened after you did one little thing. and explains it in great detail, especially in a game like Citizen Sleeper 2, just feels more satisfying to me. I'm not saying it's better on any level, but for me, I think I get more invested because it's just so tied to, again, that you can fail in a way that you can't fail in Halo or Doom, because the Doom guy always wins in that narrative. Doom guy kills the demons from hell. It's just how long it takes you to get to that point. Every restart is just re-remembering the story, like in the Prince of Persia Sands of Time, where he's like, oh, I misremembered that, because he's telling the story. It's that kind of thing. But in a game where the conflict is part of the narrative, you can fail and then keep moving.
I think it was about a year ago now, but I got very frustrated playing Witcher 3 because I was like, Geralt never loses a fight. I lose fights, but Geralt doesn't, because I reload my save and he wins. He just wins every single fight he's ever been in. And then around the same time that I noticed that in that game, I played Shadow of War, Middle-earth Shadow of War, in a game that has the Nemesis system, which, rest in peace to, is it Monolith Soft? Just got closed today.
Yeah.
In that game, when you die, it matters narratively, and that so rarely happens. I'm like generalizing now. In games with combat, it so rarely matters if you lose, and in games without combat, I think it is more frequently that there's an interesting wrinkle to losing. I don't know, that feels like too broad of a statement, but that's I'm kind of what I'm circling around.
It is a broad statement, but
yeah, and I mean, like, you think about one of the games that has the most story to tell in recent years, Baldur's Gate 3. When you fail something by the dice during conversation, the game goes on. But if you fail in a fight, 9 times out of 10, it's game over. You don't really ever lose a fight, a combat scenario, and then keep playing. But the rest of the game you do. And so, like, you're right. I think often when there is specifically combat mechanics, again, it's Commander Shepard, right? Except for some, in Mass Effect, except for some scripted moments, Shepard never loses. Shepard's the perfect soldier and always wins. Fights a dang Reaper and kills the thing, right? Would rip it open with their bare hands if they could. Bare hands, not bare hands. Anyway.
No, that's in Baldur's Gate 3.
Right. But, like, you're right. I had never thought of that either. And that's, like, a whole other existential conversation of, like, what is it like to lose as the hero, right? I mean, even I know Troy and I specifically are playing the Dragon Age games. It's the same thing. You're the hero of legend because you never lose. If you lose, it's game over.
You know what's weird is that bothers me in Inquisition. It did not bother me in Dragon Age 2 because the framing device of Dragon Age 2 worked for me. That one, you wouldn't talk about the times that he lost, but also obviously he won because they're talking about something that's going to happen. So clearly I didn't die before that. But in Dragon Age Inquisition, I have had that moment where I'm like, oh, well, I lost. Is combat just a waste of time? Is that that's where I'm going now. It's like every game with combat, it's just there for padding. There's a game I played last year called Caravan Sandwich. I don't know if you checked that out.
No, I haven't.
I haven't yet. No.
It's a open world sci-fi exploration game where there's a planet it's real messed up, and you go home to that planet and help people out by driving around in a van. And there's no combat. And that was a selling point for that game. And the thesis of my review was, I wish this game had combat. But I think the problem there is that they didn't replace the combat with a different kind of friction. So it's a game that ended up feeling like it was a open world exploration game, but it kind of felt more like a walking simulator because it was mostly just kind of going point to point. And then there were like climbing challenges, which was fine. They were like, all right, we're going to make a game without combat, but they didn't figure out a different form of conflict to make the moment to moment gameplay interesting.
Well, and you get to that idea of completing a goal. It's easy to get lost in like, well, you reach the end credits. Well, that's completing the goal. But you haven't made anything interesting, whether it's combat, whether it's conflict, whether it's, some of the best walking simulators are ones where you are sort of in a state and you are exploring it and you are piecing it together. And maybe there was a conflict and you're putting it in line. You're doing the solitaire as a funny and frustrating way to organize your deck of cards. Playing plenty of walking simulators is putting the narrative in order. And that is the friction. It isn't there yet. Whereas, there can be like, oh, we just removed this and that makes it better. Does it though?
Because I've only played a few walking simulators. I've played Firewatch and I've played Edith Finch, and I liked both of those a lot. But it is very much not my genre. And there's more to Caravan Sandwich than that. Like, there's more gameplay elements, but it just felt like there wasn't enough, and it felt like it was made to have combat in it in a weird way. There's no combat system whatsoever, but it felt like I should be running into a couple enemies every once in a while, and, I deal with them, and then I continue my journey, and I run into some more. Like, it was missing random encounters, basically. Like, that's what it felt like. I was playing a game without random encounters turned on. The absence of combat, I could feel it in that game in a way that didn't work for me. I still like that game. I don't want to say I didn't dislike the game, but that aspect of it was odd to me.
It's funny you're saying, is combat a waste of time? And narratively, it could be. I don't think it is mechanically. I'm not a combat hater. Playing Avowed right now, smashing skulls with a two-handed sword. It's great. But I think combat is meant to be fun. Whether it serves the narrative or not is irrelevant. Combat is at its best when it's fun. Like, Sea of Stars is one of my favorite RPGs because the combat is fun. Geoff and I have talked about this. It's basically a puzzle in combat form with the different effects, whatever. And I think that's what it comes down to is combat isn't a waste of time if it's fun or if it's worthwhile. But with the narrative, could combat be a waste of time? Yes, I think it's possible. And I think that's a really funny way to look at it because that's, before this conversation, something I would have never thought of. But now I want to just make a list of video games where people are awesome, but we suck as players because there's so many games where it's like they're badass because they're good, not we are, which is such a great way to look at it.
I have argued for a long time, and I did not originate the argument, but I have perpetuated it for many years. One of the reasons why you don't play as Solid Snake for most of Metal Gear Solid 2 is so that you can finally see what a badass he is when your dumb ass isn't playing as him. And there's probably a lot of games out there that do an incredible job of integrating narrative, consequence, weight, and payoff into the combat system. I mean, a game like Final Fantasy Tactics is nothing but combat, preparing for combat, and cutscenes. So narratives play out through that. Do they do a good job of it? That's not for this conversation. I don't think they do. It's a fun game, though, and I love the story. But there are times where those can work together. But on the flip side of things, do I care about the story of Joust? No. Do I put a quarter in every time I find it? Yes.
Yes.
I love that game. And it's also one that is conflict that is largely combative, but it's more about I'm taller than you and then I bumped you. This is to say that, we are talking about combat and conflict and resolution within games and the narrative ideas. And like you were saying, Troy, feels like it needs combat, feels like it needs random encounters. And considering people's opinions of random encounters, that's damning, whether you like the game or not. But what this comes down to is, what does the game need? What is the intention of the game? What is the end goal? And what are we trying to overcome? And how do we get to that? Do we want to know how the story ends? Do we want to get a high score? Do we want to be the most covered in blood at the end of it all? There are games where if you betray that, you've lost the game.
I've thought of one where you can lose combat and the story progresses. And it is the weirdest example, is AEW Fight Forever, the wrestling game for All Elite Wrestling, has a story mode in which you can lose. And you lose a match, and the story continues, and it picks up the next week, and the game goes on with that.
That's fantastic, yeah. No, that's
This
perfect.
is getting into an entirely separate conversation, but that is a game where, combat and the outcome of combat actually matters to the story.
Well, because pro wrestling combat is narrative, narrative is combat. Sports entertainment, baby!
And it doesn't work because the combat shouldn't be real, because as your character... it gets very meta. Because your character doesn't know that they're a professional wrestler. They live in kayfabe. They don't know kayfabe.
But I have thought of a true combat game that does progress even if you lose. And it's one of the most famous. It's Hades. Hades, every time you lose, the story moves forward. Because it's baked into being basically undead, and I haven't played Hades 2 yet, though I have it, and I'm very excited to play it when it's done.
I want them to sign some contracts, and then I'll play it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true,
nice.
too.
That'd be nice.
That's actually true, yeah.
Hopefully, this becomes a moot point and a moot part of the conversation. I'd love that. But you're right, Matt. Hades deliberately designed a way for loss of combat, loss of conflict in a bloody conflict to continue, to persist, and to build and to be narratively satisfying. But it was a choice made, and one that paid off greatly in the first Hades.
Yeah. Ultimately, what's interesting about playing games without combat but have conflict is how strong those narratives are. And again,
Right.
It's not that I don't believe you can't do that in games with heavy conflict. Like, I feel like games without combat but have conflict, like your Citizen Sleepers, your Disco Elysiums, your all these games we've been talking about, you are rarely the best of the best. You are usually just someone trying to get by.
You are there.
Right.
Certainly
basically.
there. Cool.
And maybe that's part of it too, right? Because in at least our real lives, I won't say everyone's, but at least in our real lives, most of our conflict is devoid of combat. Not
Sure.
all of it, but most of it.
Right, yeah.
And so I think that's also what gets to the core of relating to those narratives more, because it feels more like quote unquote real life. And I think because of that nature.
I think, too, something that we were getting at much earlier in this conversation, in video games, if you want to have combat as a form of conflict resolution, you have to have a combat system. And if that combat system exists separately from the overworld system, in, let's say, a turn-based RPG that has random encounters, well, yes, that is part and parcel of it, and we accept that as the gestalt, as the whole, as the whole piece of it. But those are two separate things. And so sometimes you're like, well, it's a slog to get through the battle system, but it is such a good narrative. It's so worth it. You've got two separate pieces going on here. You've broken up the grilled cheese again. And what we really want is a patty melt. All the pieces together. But again, you bring me the patty, the cheese, and the bread at separate times, or I can have a patty. You serve it all at once. I can have the patty melt. It's on the plate, but I can only eat one ingredient of it at a time, and you have to swallow it. You can't just put it all in your mouth at the same time. That's a lesson you always have to remember. That's a lifelong lesson. You can't put all of it in your mouth at the same time.
Geoff is working through some stuff here.
We're all working through some stuff, Matt. You just all have to listen to mine right now. But no, it is the fact of leaping through those things. And I'm reminded of the George Carlin bit about what things count as sports. And hockey isn't a sport. Hockey is a combination of three things: ice skating, playing with a puck, and beating the shit out of each other. I'd get more fun doing each of those separately versus trying to do them all at the same time. So having your combat system, because it has to be a system, if it is not the central aspect of your gameplay loop, you need to have that integrated into your conflict resolution. You can either graft it on at the end or integrate it. And these are those pieces, and sometimes it's easier to just not have a combat system for your conflict resolution.
Does Rocket League have combat?
I mean, the same way a soccer game does, I guess.
So extremely.
But in Rocket League, you do blow up the other cars. There's not a lot of soccer games where the other players explode.
But they do suffer injuries.
Yeah. Because I was thinking hockey. I was like, a hockey video game. Well, most hockey video games have a combat system because they literally have a system for fights.
We've played Blades of Steel. Yeah, absolutely. So there you go.
But if you took the fighting out of it, is hockey itself combat? Like...
Right,
There's
but then
checking.
it's like, is sports conflict
Is
or
sports
combat?
Yeah.
Sports is what we found to have combat and to simulate combat without death. Yes. This is now
Exactly.
Granted, you look at the brain scans of former professional football players and let's argue how successful that was.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, sports is combat with pads on it, both literally and metaphorically, depending on the sport. And what are the earliest video games but sports games?
I suppose, yeah, because if you think about it, like, if we take it out of video games and just go to sports, in football, if you, like, run as fast as you can and dive into someone's midsection and knock them to the ground, that's fine. But if I did that to someone, that would be combat. So,
Yes.
like, the context of that action, like, the action itself changes depending on the context around it.
And there's a lot of things I love to do in video games and do often in video games that would be downright illegal, distasteful, and actually things I don't want to do in real life.
Yeah.
The joy of fantasy.
Yeah.
The power of it.
This was incredible. I feel like we could keep going, but I think now we're kind of weaving our way into a new topic that we don't have time for.
We've done a pretty good job defining what combat is, so I think now we can start our conversation about games that don't have combat.
Right, exactly.
We walk in with a bloody football helmet. Behold, a war! Welcome to the symposium, listeners. Now we turn it to you.
Oh, goodness.
Before we wrap up, of course, Troy, thank you for joining us. This was a lot of fun. You'll have to come back when we talk about combat, ? No, we...
Combat without video games.
Exactly.
Hang on, let me check. I want to make sure I got all my weird ones off the list. So last we talked about Power Wash Simulator is an interesting one.
Power Wash Simulator is not combat. Power Wash Simulator I would also call a solitaire-style satisfaction game.
But it's a shooting game, which is interesting.
Is Portal.
That's true.
Portal has...
Next one on the list.
Yeah.
There we go.
Portal
Yep.
also. Shooting, but no combat.
Death Stranding apparently doesn't have combat. I've barely started that game, but the internet says that you just, again, it's a hide from the threat of violence, apparently.
Citizen Sleeper as made by Hideo Kojima, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Basically.
And then here's one that I don't know how to feel about. Shadow of the Colossus.
They're
Violence without combat?
Ooh.
Anyway, you can wrap up the podcast now. I just wanted to make sure.
I know, that's a
Fallout.
great one to go out on.
Yeah, because Shadow of the Colossus, though, it is you're committing. Like, there's a combat system for taking out the Colossi.
I think there's a swing your sword at stuff button, but
Yeah.
There is.
But then back to Little Gator Game, like you swing your sword at stuff in Little Gator Game. Aren't you like attacking like rocks in Shadow of the Colossus that are their
Right.
weak points?
And this comes down to the anthropomorphization of things, and one of the funnier lines from Final Fantasy The Spirits Within movie, arguing about planetology and the planet being alive, and one of the, military characters going, so if I were to take out a gun and shoot it at the ground, apparently I'm not only wasting a bullet, I'm hurting something. And that argues about what...
Yeah.
You can swing your sword at the ground in Shadow of the Colossus, and this is not a violent action, but you go after one of the 16 colossi, and it certainly is.
Huh.
This is the argument of definition and of categorization. Categorization is so much fun. We try to do it so often through genre, gameplay, and everything else in video games, but the second you start breaking it all down, it is never quite so easily defined. I love this.
Yeah. And as usual, we come to the end of an episode with sort of a thesis, but not really, and leaving it open to the audience.
A clearer picture and no conclusion. Honestly, I say that's a life well lived.
Yeah, that's all we ask for here. But Troy, thank you for joining us. This was a blast. Please tell folks where they can find you online if you wish to be found, where to find your stuff, the best place to interact, all that good stuff.
So, TroytlePower presents the Power Playthroughs podcast with TroytlePower, a video game podcast.
Anybody who's listening at 1.2 times speed just got really screwed over. Thank you.
Just go on to Google and search TPP, and you'll find it. You can find me on Blue Sky as TroytlePower. That's where I'm active, social media stuff. But really, I'm much more active on Discord. I'm hanging out in the CPOV Discord, and then I've got some of my own as well. If you want to find other audio-only Let's Play podcasters, let me know. I will send you an invite to one of the weirdest little communities that you'll find on the internet of very kind folks. And then I write at Geek to Geek Media, which is geektogeekmedia.com. I want to just call out two things that I do over at the Probably Work podcast network, which you can find at probablywork.com. Our website sucks right now because our host deleted it for some reason, and so we're basically rebuilding. But anyway,
Oh no.
if you go to probablywork.com, you can find information about Podcasters Assemble, which I mentioned earlier. It's still ongoing, I just don't do it, and Super Switch Club, which are both communities where people pick a game or a movie, and everybody experiences it on their own, records their experience, and sends it in, and then we have a team of editors who merge all that together into coherent podcast episodes that are really fun and very community-driven.
I love that. That's awesome. Well, everyone go check that out. Geoff will include a link to Troy's website, and you can probably find everything through there. We turn it to the listeners. What are your favorite games to have conflict in without any combat? Is there a favorite kind of game that you like to play that doesn't have combat? Do you only play games with combat, and why? all of these and more to continue the conversation in the Discord or in other places.
Do you try to find combat mechanics in so-called cozy games? Do you try to see how much damage you can do with the butterfly net? Do you see how little damage you can do in seemingly violent games? Do you push on those boundaries as your own form of conflict resolution and seeking of friction in your gameplay? Just because you've been given objectives doesn't mean you have to obey them the way that you think they do. Although I would appreciate it if you wanted to reach out to us, you went through one of the ways that we actually check so that we could continue to have this conversation.
Yes.
We are Fun and Games Pod on all social media that we are active on as of this episode, which is Blue Sky, Instagram, and Tumblr. We are funandgamespod@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of this episode, what you thought of previous episodes, what you'd like us to talk about, and who you'd like us to talk with on future episodes. If you're interested on talking about a game you love and why you love it and being part of our side quest series, you can reach out to us on that email address to propose a game perhaps, or reach out to us on social media and Matt will get back to you. You can go to certainpov.com and find not only other fantastic Certain POV podcasts, of which we are one of them, but also a permanent invite link to our Discord server where TroytlePower is hanging out and a lot of our conversations continue. If you want a one-stop shop of all the things that we're working on or have the means or desire to financially support us a little bit, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/funandgamespod. There is a free tier, so you don't have to give any money to take part in the polls of what our next console retrospective will be, to access the RSS feed of all of our content. But we do appreciate everybody on the Patreon, and we do want to shout out everybody on the high scoreboard. Today, the high scoreboard is Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Nyden, Alejandro Alves, Chris Copleen, Curly Bright, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Robert Prine, Sean Bowen, and Wes Bates. Thank you so much for your support. Please enter your initials. You are standing in a dark field. The alphabet and several symbols are in front of you. It is pitch black. You are likely to be eaten by a grue.
Classic. Of course, also, if you can't support us monetarily, totally okay. A free way that you can help us and Troy and any other podcaster is to go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Pocket Cast or Good Pods, literally anything that allows for rating and reviews. And writing a quick rating and review takes a few minutes, really helpful. I've learned that on Spotify, even though it yells at you that you have to listen first, if you just skim ahead like a minute and a half using the jump ahead feature, you can then rate that podcast. So go in there and rate all your favorites.
And that's how you overcome the conflict of getting to rate a podcast on Spotify. It's not
Well
combat. There you go.
Exactly.
Whether you are rating and reviewing, and we do appreciate all of the ratings and reviewings that we do receive, whether you are on the Discord or taking part in any of the social media conversations, or if this is your first episode of Fun and Games, thank you so much for being here. We couldn't do this without you. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Hello, my name is Aaron. I'm one half of Superpod Saga, a topical variety video game podcast fueled entirely by nostalgia and unleaded gasoline. Superpod Saga, we discuss a different video game topic each and every week. We have new episodes every single Monday covering a different video game topic. More than anything, we want to entertain our listeners and make you feel like you're one of the boys, like you're hanging out at a campfire with some of your best zany caffeine-powered buddies and just talking about your favorite games and all that stuff. Stop on down to Superpod Saga. It's on every podcatcher there is. If it's not, let me know and we'll get on it. But again, Superpod Saga, stop on by.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.
a bonus episode that's on the Patreon. Go join the Patreon. And then also
That was a main episode, I think.
Oh no, that was
we
the
did the
main
review
episode.
as a bonus episode.
Look, time is a lake. But that's an
It's not a
interesting
lake,
point.
it's an ocean.
It's a weird soup.
Sorry.
It's a spiral. Anyway, I love that